Well, it's great to be back with you again this morning as we continue our journey looking at Romans 2 and again unpacking some of the profound stuff, but I think very difficult stuff that Paul has to say. One of the things I like about, I like it about Scripture as a whole, but especially about the Apostle Paul, is that Paul has a way of just cutting away all the extraneous stuff, all the kind of non-consequential stuff, and getting right to the heart of the matter. And just like last week, when we looked at Paul calling out the nature of sin, calling out deception, calling out judgment, this week we're going to look at Paul once again going for the jugular and getting right to the heart of it. If somebody were to ask you a question, how smart do you think you are? How good looking do you think you are? How healthy are you? I think probably, like most of us, if you border on the modest to, well, possibly negative side, you'd probably answer, I'm not particularly smart or I'm not particularly good looking. And if you were one of them people who would answer more in the negative, would it surprise you to learn that you are in the minority? Research was done recently that said that most people see themselves in far more a positive light than you'd care to imagine. And so when asked those very same questions, they were discovered to be quite over-optimistic about themselves. People felt that they were actually very good looking, or they were funnier, or they were healthier, or they were kind of less annoying and more patient than they actually were. In fact, all things being equal, researchers said that most people carry around with themselves an opinion that they are altogether kind of a more rounded, normal person than the next guy. So the field of social psychology has a word for this. They call it illusory superiority. It's a phrase that they coin which defines someone who overestimates their own qualities and abilities alongside the same qualities and abilities they find in others. They have another phrase for it too, not just illusory superiority, but in the fields of social psychology, they also refer to this as what they call a cognitive bias. That's an interesting phrase, because what it really means is that we create a subjective reality. We take what we feel, what we see, what we hear, we kind of mold it, define it, and then we create a preferred reality or a kind of a picture of what we'd like to be true of us to the public that we paint. In that kind of scenario, of course, we inevitably paint a picture that is better than it actually is. Now, I want you to hold that idea of illusory superiority or cognitive bias in your mind as we progress in Romans 2, because there's a little bit of that weird and wacky psychology going on in these Jewish readers, particularly as Paul is writing to them. If you recall last week in the first 16 verses, we looked at the words sin, deception, and judgment. And it's kind of been my thought as I've walked through this to capture Romans 2 in 7 words. Those were the first 3. And this week I want to look at 4 more words: delusion, reality, misconstrued, and authentic. And as we go through this particular passage, you'll see how each of those words are defining an argument, but also Paul is capturing an attitude, a behavioral trait, or a mentality that he's trying to oppose. In verses 17 to 20, we get the first of those 4 words, the word delusion. Look at what Paul says in 17. But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God and know his will and approve what is excellent, because you are instructed from the law, and if you are sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. I kind of want to just pause it right there, because in 3 short verses, Paul offers 4 avenues of what we might consider to be cognitive bias. To these Jews, they had subjectively created a reality that was communicating, whether this was intentional or not, communicating that there was an element of superiority that they had that others didn't. The others, namely, being the Gentiles, the Romans, and all those who were non-Jewish. Paul says, you call yourself a Jew. Because what he's identifying in verse 17 is the conviction that their ethnicity was richer and more meaningful than anybody else's. And as we said last week, there was good reason for that. He talks about them relying on the law and boasting in God, their idea that they were greater privileged than anyone else. Then there was the deeper knowledge they believed they had. He says, you know his will, you approve of what is excellent. And then the overall superiority in verse 19, when Paul says, you are sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind. Cognitive bias, illusory superiority, going wild, going rampant. Usually when that happens, 9 times out of 10, it creates very self-deluded people. And so this whole idea, Paul says, of being misguided, if you like, and being deluded is a strong thing that's going on here. The reason why oftentimes it becomes kind of elusive and the way that we become very deceptive is because when we play this game of illusory superiority, or if you like, you can call it ego enhancement, or you can call it image management, no one creates a reality basically that portrays them in a very, very negative light. If left to ourselves, we don't paint a picture of ourselves that shows us as overly cruel or deeply uncaring or detached or unimaginative or boring. It's a terrible condemnation we feel that when we go to a party and we're met for the first time by friends who may not have known us, or they know someone that we know, and they define us as an uninteresting or boring or difficult person. That's like a curse. And so we like to shape ourselves in far more colourful lights. Paul is aware that with all this thinking, there is a deep bias in his Jewish brothers. They're living under this cloud of a subjective reality they've created. They've drawn this comparison chart, if you like, and they have come out on top. And in doing so, and here's the difficulty of this, when you take what you are and you use that as a way of defining yourself as better than someone else, you effectively weaponize the very things that you consider as virtues or as abilities. Rather than using them to connect, using them to bless, using them to uplift, they become, if you like, weapons used against others. And so their ethnicity, in the sense of these Jews, their theology, their standing with God, their heritage, they effectively position themselves in a very superior place. And in doing that, was telling everyone else that they are not quite as good as us. Now, whether that was very intentional or not, Paul feels that in some of the writings there, it is intentional. But we can be sometimes just as biased and just as deluded when we consider our own personal growth in God. There are times when we consider ourselves to be spiritually stronger, perhaps, than we actually are. We're denying the fact that there is a huge weakness being developed somewhere in our experience. Sometimes we can say that the difficult habits we have are not as ingrained as others perceive them to be, but we deny that. Sometimes our mood swings, we say, are not as frequent, and yet others would say differently. We create, if you like, this cognitive bias, this kind of preferred reality of who we are, and see ourselves as more polite and more patient, perhaps, more accommodating and more selfless than we actually are, which is never a great place to be. Or alternatively, we take that healthy spiritual life, or that active church involvement that we've got, or respected status, or advanced theological knowledge, whatever it is that we consider to be something quite good about ourselves, and we use it as a positioning tool to put ourselves above others who perhaps aren't as healthy in their spirituality, or not as active in church, not as respected, or not as advanced in their understanding of God. And in short, as I've said, we not only weaponize those things against others, but we kind of become toxic within ourselves. We inject some poisonous stuff into those virtues and into those privileges, and they become things that harm rather than things that connect and bless and enhance the lives of others. So Paul's first problem, as we look at 17 onwards, is there is this huge delusion that's being played out, intentionally or not, that is becoming harmful, not only becoming toxic to them and displaying them in an ugly light, but it's impacting negatively on those around them. But then he's not finished, because he goes on to another word, which is kind of following on from the very same idea that he's just done. Now he's kind of turning it over to a challenge, turning it over to a positive. And Paul hits them with a very unexpected and yet deeply disturbing list of questions. Now have a look again at verse 21. This is what we read. You then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? Verse 22. You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, dishonor God by breaking the law. For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. In short, Paul is saying in that short cluster of verses, how real is this to you? That is an incredibly disturbing question for anyone who's been a Christian for any amount of time. You know, sometimes the imagination says that if you've been a Christian for a brief spell of time, you're always insecure about whether you've got it, whether you're living the right thing, whether you believe the right thing, whether you're doing it correctly, because, you know, after all, you're not wise and experienced in this, you're kind of just feeling the ropes a bit. But the danger of this kind of falsity, the danger of inauthenticity, lies far stronger in those who've been doing this a while than it does in those who've just started. The danger to get into a pattern, the danger to build a routine that communicates to you that that is the reality, is an incredible, precious one. It is very easy to create the Christian life that has the appearance of genuineness, but in reality, it is just a scaffold, an apparatus that we are worshipping, that we are following. And this is where you begin to unpack the heart of the Jewish readers, particularly in Rome, as they looked at what Paul was saying. The difficulty of getting to a place of building this kind of system through which we honor God, where the system becomes the focus and the fascination and not the God behind it. I remember many years ago, I came across a story of an Aboriginal tribe that was being sought to be reached by this missionary society right out there in the Australian Northern Territory. And the missionary society prayed over this guy and loved over this guy and educated him and inspired him and then stuck him on a horse and sent him out there to the border of the territory to reach those Aboriginal people. So off he went, full of hope and full of bright positivity. And as he got to the edge of the territory of the compound of where they were, he was met by the tribal leader with about 6 or 7 other members of his tribe. There was a bit of a standoff for a few seconds before the tribal leader said, if you wish to enter and become part of us, there's just one thing we require. And at that point, the missionary was rather encouraged, thinking, oh, great, I thought this was going to be a really long process of trying to connect to these people. Looks like I can do this very quickly. He said, what is it? He said, you get off your horse, roll up your sleeves, and you fight one of our tribal members. Well, of course, as he said this, beginning to shift from the back of the pack of these few tribesmen was, of course, the largest and widest native that he could possibly imagine seeing. For a split second, he realized that the only way he was going to get through here was he would have to fight this huge fellow. He thought for a while. He shot up a few arrow prayers to God, and within seconds turned his horse around and shot off back across the desert area. Tribal people returned to their compound, but a few months later, the missionary society, not to be put off, not to be deterred, sent a second man that they were convinced would have what it took to go in and finish this job and start a missionary connection and reach people. And lo and behold, yes, he was met by the same tribal leader and the same group of tribal folks and was given the same challenge. Get off your horse, roll up your sleeves, fight one of our men. And once again, this man found he just couldn't do it. And it kind of put a hold stall in the missionary society's progress in that area until some time later, a prize fighter got converted to Christ. Lo and behold, this prize fighter had a passion to reach others. And through a little bit of encouragement, they convinced him that the Aboriginal people would be the ideal kind of area for him to serve God and to kind of exercise that passion that he had. Well, of course, they managed to convince him, stuck on a horse and sent the prize fighter out to the Aboriginals. As he approached the edge of the forest, the edge of the area, the compound, once again he was met by the tribal leader and a group with him. And once again, he was given the same challenge. If you want to progress and be part of us, then you know to get off your horse, roll up your sleeves, and fight one of our men. Well, the prize fighter took one long look at him, trying to work out whether this was the Christian thing to do. After all, he hadn't been a Christian for years and years and years. He was trying to figure out whether reverting back to his old life would be a wise or a good thing. But realizing that he felt like he'd had no other option, he got off his horse, rolled up his sleeves, and was ready for any contender coming at him. At that point, the tribal leader got off his horse, walked over to him, slapped his hand on his back and said to him, "You don't need to fight anybody today. I just wanted to know whether you were for real or not." And I think that when it comes to reality, here's Paul in 4 short verses. He's largely presenting a series of piercing questions that effectively are asking these Jews to get off your horse and fight. Paul wants to know how genuine what they have is. Are they for real? And in doing that, he identifies 2 classic problems which we could say are symptoms to false religion, or as Dietrich Bonhoeffer used to say, cheap grace. That idea that we are doing without any cost, without any essence. We're just operating in the form of a thing rather than embracing the essence of it. And so when Paul begins to open this up, he recognizes that first of all, these Jews had largely become theorists of what they held, not practitioners. They had the law, they had the prophets, they loved their prayers and rituals, they adored their traditions and ceremonies, but none of these, Paul identified, was piercing them at a heart level. Isn't that a great challenge for us? You have all the stuff, the accoutrements of faith, your Bible reading and fellowship and breaking of bread and worship, and yet sometimes none of that can hit you at a heart level. The second thing Paul identified is he identified that these Jews had become quite proud of what they felt they had. They were quite proud of all the elements of their faith. And again, this is something that is a huge challenge to us. It is very easy to not just do a good thing, but to become proud of doing it. In fact, the old Puritans used to say, if the devil can't stop you doing something, he'll make you proud of doing it. And effectively, he has stopped you doing it. And sometimes we can become very proud of our reading and our praying. We can become very protective of our church, our fellowship, our circle of friends, our way of doing things. We become quite possessive of our gifts, our ministries. We really struggle when somebody operates the same ministry slightly better, or is greeted with a greater sense of reputation and applause than we are. And all these things we say, no, that's not what's right. You know, I'm just humbly serving. I'm just humbly doing what I'm doing. But in reality, what's going on in the heart is something very different. And so Paul is identifying that what they had was good, but because they were holding it in envious and superior ways, it became a weapon that was used to kind of put other people at a disadvantage. So Paul is dealing with delusion. He's challenging them with reality. And the third word, when you come to verse 25, is this word misconstrued. Somewhere along the line, they had lost touch with what it was all about. And this is what it says in verse 25. For circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law. But if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. So if a man who is uncircumcised keeps the precepts of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? Then he who is physically uncircumcised but keeps the law will condemn you who have the written code and circumcision but break the law. Now, if you're relatively new to the faith, that made no sense whatsoever. What on earth is all this circumcision stuff? You've got to drop back, way back to Genesis 17 to have any kind of idea what the heck Paul is talking about there. In Genesis 17, we pick up the story of Abraham, who has been chosen by God back in Genesis 12 and told that he's going to father a nation. At that time, his name was Abram, a name that meant exalted father. God had put a great price and privilege on his head. But at the point in Genesis 17, he's now known as Abraham. And Abraham meant a father of many. And by giving him that name, God cemented the directional force that Abraham's life was going to take. As a sign and a seal of that promise, God required Abraham and his offspring to be circumcised. That act was a proof of that covenant and a reminder of this deep commitment that the two of them and the people of God from that time on would share. And in fact, if at any point, anyone desiring to be part of the covenant, to enjoy the blessing of God, the absolute requirement was they had to be circumcised. Over a period of time, what Paul had an issue with is this: the act of circumcision became the be-all and end-all. The weight of the importance moved away from what circumcision represented to circumcision itself. It became a badge of inclusion, a badge of right, a badge of privilege. It was no longer a question of, do you love God? Are you serving God? Do you love the covenant? It became just a question of, are you circumcised? Because unless you are, you can't be a real Jew. And this is a huge issue throughout Paul's letters, because as you go on and read Galatians and other letters, Paul is constantly in conflict with the Jews as they're converting to Christ, believing that although we're converted and although Jesus died for us, you still have to be circumcised to be real, to be proper. And Paul had this constant argument with them, a constant conflict. The rite, the act, became the be-all and end-all. And I think that when we look at this and realize this, how true is this of us today, where we experience a shift of the central focus of what we're about. We become consumed with, or we overemphasize certain worship practices or particular doctrines, or the little things we do, baptism and church membership policies and communion. And we have seen churches split over these things because they become the be-all and end-all. They become the dividing line. I remember as I was growing up in my late teens after I was converted, talking with guys of a certain doctrinal persuasion, convincing me that those who didn't hold that persuasion, they didn't even think they were Christian. And it became that what mattered more was the point of doctrine, the matter of what you believed on a particular issue. Those doctrines and teachings are meant to draw us to God and help us to embrace Him and envelop Him further into our lives. And yet they become the mark of demarcation, if you like. They become the proof of whether you've got it or not, as they would say. And Paul is kind of slightly appalled here that circumcision, that wonderful truth that identified the love and the covenant of God, had become a weapon used against those who felt, did I need to or do I not need to do this? And defining them in a different way. When it comes to our faith in God and our progress in God, do you know there's really only two requirements that are necessary? And it isn't that you know your Bible back to front. It isn't that you attend every church meeting. It isn't that you sing every worship song. It isn't that you mustn't ever swear or do anything ever wrong again. It's two things only. One, do you love God and do you love others? In reality, when Jesus was challenged against a whole backdrop of complex laws, Jesus said, all the law, all the prophets can be summed up in this: love God, love your neighbor. I love the simplicity and yet the profoundness of that. If these two elements cease to be the be-all and end-all, what happens? We slide out of relationship, out of that genuine connection, out of that casual, informal walk, and we move into the complexities and difficulties and layered complications of religion. And it ceases to be something that is a blessing and becomes very much a curse. So Paul says, here we're struggling. The delusion that you operate under at time, that cognitive bias, that subjective reality, the reality, the challenge that to be real and to make this real. Part of the problem, the misconstruedness, the way you have kind of misunderstood certain elements and changed the emphasis of them. And finally, this fourth and final word you pick up in verse 28 and 29. And I love this because Paul kind of brings everything to the heart of the matter here as we look at this word authentic. Look at what he says in verse 28. For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical. Here's the crux of it, verse 29. But a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. Some years ago in Long Beach, California, a guy was out on a date with his girl, decided to go into a chicken fried kind of restaurant place, whether it was a KFC or not, I'm not sure. He ordered his chicken meal, and as he's waiting, the young waitress handed in the bag that he assumed was his chicken dinners. Off he went with his date down to the place that he pre-planned to have a picnic, and as they all sat down and laid out the cloth, do whatever they needed to do, and opened the bag up, they found inside it $800 of hard cash. He was to find out that the young girl, not knowing, had picked up the day's takings and handed that to him rather than his chicken dinner. What a quandary he was left with. Does he just take the money and go? Who on earth would ever know anyway? This man decided to take the money and go back to the restaurant and explain to the manager that what had happened. The manager, when he got back to the store, was by this time frantic, realizing that all the day's takings was gone. His superiors would demand an answer, and if he was going to have to pay out of his own pocket, he would never afford that amount of money. To see the fella and his date walk through the door was a curious thing to him, but he didn't connect straight away that right there was the embodiment of his solution, if you like. The man put the money on the counter and he explained what had happened, and he said, I just wanted to bring this back. And as he turned to leave, the manager, who was ecstatic with joy by now, said to him, no, you mustn't leave. Wait, I'm going to call the newspaper. I'm going to put you in the paper. You are a hero. And he got a hold of his shoulders. He said, you're the most honest man that I've ever met in my life. And as he went to pick up the phone, the man turned to him and said, no, listen, don't call the newspaper. Honestly, don't call the newspaper. Don't worry about that. And when the man said, what on earth for? He said, because the woman I'm with is not my wife. She's somebody else's. Here's the thing. The frightening truth about inauthenticity is that it doesn't just reside in the obviously hypocritical. Inauthenticity can hide even in authentic behavior. While you are bringing back the money in honesty, you can be sleeping with another man's wife. While you're doing serving God, loving church, reading scripture, there can be a whole world of inauthenticity going on in your head, in your heart, in your soul. You're handing the money back and everybody wants to applaud you, but inside you're, betraying that in some other action. And in the same way, Paul says, under the guise of circumcision and the law and ritual and practice, he's saying to these Jews, you are becoming less and less authentic. You're becoming more and more out of touch with what this reality is all about. And of course, it's always a challenging thought to think, what do I hide behind when I do my church attendance or my worship or my Bible reading? What does that become a cover for? This is where Paul says, is this really real? Is it really true? All the stuff that we do as Christians, of course, is but the signs, it's the scaffold, it's the apparatus of what truly matters. The worship we sing and the Bible readings we do and the ministries we're involved in, the programs we launch and the things that we volunteer for, they are all pointing us towards something far more central, far more foundational, far more significant. Largely, it's that heart relationship with God. But when the signs themselves become the be-all and end-all, when the scaffold becomes the object of our fascination and our joy and our security and our interest and our sense of well-being, what happens is this: we drain from us the essence of faith, and we embrace and cement within us the form of faith. And there's a whole world of difference between essence and form. Form breeds pride and privilege. Essence creates humility. When we really get it, it impacts us. When we're full of form, it just encourages that sense of perhaps we're better than, perhaps we're wiser than, perhaps we're greater than. Whereas essence inspires commonality. It helps me see you for you and you see me for me. When we share a sense of mutual brokenness and mutual connection, we see each other far differently. Form creates superficiality on the whole. When it's just about the things that we do, there's a veneer to it that just doesn't look right. Whereas essence, that produces rich authenticity. 4 words, 4 key principles. What a challenge to us this morning. Are we operating on the delusion we are creating daily our own subjective reality rather than facing who we're actually becoming? Are we picking up the challenge of being real? Are we getting off the horse and willing to fight because it means something to us? Are we living under misconstrued ideas of the past teachings and thoughts? We're not keeping the main thing as the main thing. Are we being authentic in our life? Are we living the essence and not just the form? Can I challenge you to take this chapter and these verses we've read this morning and reread them and challenge them? And maybe perhaps as you do that, God will encourage you and help you and support you in that journey to living as real as you possibly can. God bless you.